Good morning, everybody. We'd like to welcome you here. It's straight up 10 o'clock. So we're going to start our March 18th edition of Farm Office Live. I'd like to welcome you to today's program on a beautiful Friday morning here across the state of Ohio. And as always, I'd like to begin by introducing our teaching team. First is Diane Shoemaker, OSU Extension Field Specialist in Dairy Production Economics. We have Barry Ward, the Director of OSU Income Tax Schools and the Leader for Production Business Management. On a well-deserved break this week is Peggy Hall, who's on vacation, so we won't be getting any updates from Peggy, but never fear, we have Robert Moore aboard as well. I'm David Marison, Agriculture and Natural Resource Extension Educator in Coshocton County. We're very, very pleased that Sing-Ki Lee is going to join us today for a grain marketing update. Sing-Ki is an assistant professor in our Ag Econ department. Robert Moore, attorney for the OSU Agriculture Law and Resource Law program, is aboard. And making all the magic work behind the scenes is Jeff Lewis, attorney and program coordinator for OSU Extension. So we'd like to welcome you aboard and I'll give you a reminder that the recording of Wednesday evenings, as well as a recording of today's program, can be found on go.osu.edu/farm office live, as well as you can find the PowerPoint slides from today's program there as well. And I think Jeff just dropped it in the chat box for you. And that's just a great reminder that we'll be monitoring the Q&A feature of the program for you to drop your questions in any time as we go through today's program. We'll be reserving the chat feature for Jeff to drop in some important links for you as we go along the way today. So look at the Q&A button feature if you want to ask a question, and you'd be watching your chat box as well for some of those links that you can click on your own computer and download or go to those websites that we talk about. Just a reminder, as you exit today's program, we do have a quick evaluation that is there for you to complete. Should only take you a couple minutes, but again, we will be looking at those evaluations as we plan our April broadcast. I think it was mentioned in the previous evaluations that want to learn more about the grain marketing outlook. So that's why Dr. Lee is with us today, as well as some of the questions with Medicaid or nursing home costs. That was in some of our former evaluations. So we're pulling those topics into today's program. So your evaluations are crucial for us. As far as today's agenda, we're going to start off with a quick federal legislation and program update. Then we're going to go into one of the hottest topics, continues to be a hot topic, the fertilizer update. And Barry keeps tweaking. I think this is the year that Barry probably wakes up every day and tweaks those budgets. And he's going to share some of those updates, or maybe it feels, Barry, like you're updating those budgets every day. And then we get into a grain marketing outlook, and then we'll go into long-term care costs. And then Diane Shoemaker is going to share some of the financial efficiency review for grain farms, an intriguing look at some of those financial parameters for our grain farmers, grain farms that participated in our FinPAC analysis program. And then finally, I'll round it out, taking a look at one of our partner agencies that we're very, very fond of, and that is our Farm Service Agency. So with that, we're going to run right into the federal legislation and program update, and I'm going to ask Robert Moore to take over just for one quick slide to talk about our federal legislation update.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So we've been tracking federal legislation for the last year or so. And fortunately, there's been quite a bit of progress. Federal debt limit and the large infrastructure bill was passed last year. The most recent developments just this week, President Biden signed the government funding bill. So the federal government is funded through the fiscal year, which is the end of September. So we don't have to worry about any government shutdowns until at least October 1st. The legislation that is still pending is the Build Back Better, the full bill of 1.75 or 2 trillion, depending on how you count it. That bill is not going to happen. I think we can officially call it dead. But the most recent development on this is there is a group of House Democrats that are proposing to carve out a climate change portion. Senator Manchin, who's probably been the biggest holdup for the Democrats getting this passed, has seemed to express some interest in negotiating on that, provided the deficit is reduced. The deficit would be reduced most likely by increasing the corporate tax rate and the capital gains tax rate. So seems like there's some informal discussions going on. We'll see how that plays out. So it could be that we get some portion or some parts of the Build Back Better done, but we'll just have to wait and see. Definitely a lot of uncertainty around that.
Thank you, Robert. That's a quick update, but I know that our legislature, they're really concerned what's happening over in Russia and Ukraine. And so see some movement, and we'll be especially watching those capital gains tax that you talk about. Just a quick reminder on some federal program updates. We understand that earlier this week, well, a huge deadline with the ARC PLC rolled through on March 15th, but we also have a couple other deadlines that are still sticking out there for producers, especially those hog and dairy producers. First, the dairy margin coverage and supplemental dairy margin coverage program. That sign up continues here until March 25th. That's a program that Diane has spoke at length here on Farm Office Live on some of our previous broadcasts. And as just a reminder, also the spot market hog pandemic program for hog producers, that deadline, as we mentioned last month, has been extended. Was supposed to end on February 25th, but that was extended to April 15th. So 2 programs, if you're dairy or a hog producer, you want to make sure that you check into those. As well as I want to mention on you're hearing a lot more talk, and I see Mike Eastat, our friend, is on today with talking about climate smart, talking about carbon sequestration. A lot of that is in the news, and the USDA, of course, has voluntary programs and services. And I think you'll see that they're starting to lump these all under the climate smart label, whether we're looking at reducing greenhouse gases, or we're looking at the things that we can do to help sequester carbon. That includes some of the programs that we've spoke about here on Farm Office Live, with the Conservation Reserve Program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, as well as the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. But no, that's the kind of a terminology you'll start to hear, climate smart. And we wanted to mention, because we mentioned this the other night, that there is a partnership out there for climate smart opportunities for producing commodities. Now, this is maybe not a partnership that is going to bring funding back to the farm level, but it is allowing for universities such as the Ohio State University to come together with some partnerships with industry and potentially some local farms. And this program was announced on February 7th. There's $1 billion in partnerships to support climate smart pilot projects that might be conducted across the nation. And some of those could be with forestry practices, as well as practices that we talk, for instance, like cover crops there at the farm level. So there is a proposal that is out there, and Ohio State is working on one. There's 2 funding pools. And those deadlines were tweaked a little bit here, even this month, that the first round is going to be due on May 6th. There's $5 million to $100 million proposals that can be submitted, and then a second one on June 10th, which is targeted to our socially disadvantaged producers with a $250,000 grant to just under $5 million. So there's some opportunities. I know here at Ohio State, we're looking at potentially, hopefully getting some funding there to help support climate smart pilot projects. So more for that in future. So with that, Barry, I'm going to turn it to you for fertilizer update and crop budget to look ahead. Like I said, I think you're tweaking these and you tweaked them again this week. So excited that you could share and keep us updated. So Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And it's good to be back with everyone again. We're glad you could join us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on as I see it in the fertilizer industry and what's going on domestically and globally, and some of the key fundamentals that are affecting us now and may affect us into the near future in terms of fertilizer prices. And we'll also kind of take an overview and a look at some of the costs and how those are changing as we go through the latter part of the winter. And I guess we're closing in on the end of winter technically, aren't we? Only 3 or 4 or 5 more days or something. And then we'll take a look at the overall crop budget. So let's take a look first of all, as we kind of look at all the costs. And this is a work in progress as we look at these costs from last fall. As we're going through the latter part of the winter, these numbers continue to change as we gather more information, and all of the different variables change. And we look at seed costs. We had this a little bit higher earlier in the winter. However, as we gather a little bit more information, we're plugging in about a 5% higher seed cost for this production year. Crop protection chemicals, much higher than last year. And some of the products are even higher than this 50% that we're quoting here. Some are much lower. So it kind of the basket of crop protection chemicals, we're plugging in right now about 50% higher total costs for the 3 different primary commodity crops: corn, soybeans, and wheat, what we're looking at in this analysis. As energy prices have continued to be very volatile here in the last few weeks, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've tweaked these prices a little bit higher than where they were. However, we're a little uncertain as far as where we're going to end up in terms of an average. But right now, we're plugging in about 25% higher drying costs, diesel prices about 60% higher. And right now, we're assuming a $4 average on farm or at the farm diesel cost, hauling about 20% higher. And you can see down at the very bottom, the numbers that we're assuming right now for our fertilizer costs and some of the different products that we actually plug into our budgets. So we're looking at $1,500 per ton in anhydrous ammonia, MAP at $925, and potash at $815. And those latter two making another move up here in the last couple of weeks. So much higher costs, as you can see. So we look at fertilizer specifically. Some of this is going to be information that I've discussed in previous sessions and last month, but I think it's useful to go back and take a look at some of the key drivers on fertilizer costs so we can have an idea where we stand now, but also here in the near future, what might continue to influence these fertilizer prices and some things that might give us some relief. So first of all, demand. With high crop prices, it typically goes hand in hand with these higher fertilizer costs, and we continue to see that with strong domestic and global fertilizer demand. Farmers aren't going to typically draw back on their demand for many of these products globally, and that's what we, for the most part, continue to see. On the supply side, a lot of these things we've discussed and have been, I guess, in the market and have been accounted for. But the fertilizer sector, mentioned this earlier, really kind of caught flat-footed in the fall of 20.
They're your cousins.
And getting a little bit of, I think that means I'm supposed to start singing along, but okay, we'll go back and continue to hit fertilizer here. Delayed and lengthier fertilizer plant turnarounds. A lot of this is due to some of the pandemic related issues, labor shortages and other things. The shipping issues that continue to plague us globally, mainly due to some of the pandemic issues. Some of the weather related concerns that we've had in the past, as I mentioned here with hurricane and in the February freeze last year. High natural gas prices, in particular in Europe, that have affected fertilizer manufacturing and prices. It's been an issue. And we go to the next slide then, and we look at some trade specific issues that have also impacted the supply side. China halting phosphate and certain nitrogen fertilizer exports, almost completely halted those. Sanctions on Belarus earlier, prior to this Russian invasion. And that's largely to do with illegal immigrants being pushed across the border into the EU from Belarus. Earlier, also in this last month, Belaruskali declared force majeure, indicating that it wouldn't be able to meet contracts. So that was on a broader scale, and not just for the US and the EU. So that was another hit to the marketplace and the supply side, especially for potash. Of course, the big news in the last month, and the one that's got markets shaken up all over, is the Russian invasion and the ongoing war against Ukraine. On the one side, Russia does have a significant presence in fertilizer manufacturing and export to the world. So that's going to be impacted because they have suspended fertilizer exports, and we don't know yet how widespread that's going to be. That continues to be news trickling out on that particular aspect of what's going on with the Russian export and manufacturing. But what we do suspect is that there's going to be pretty much elimination of Russian exports to Western countries that have sanctioned them. The other side of the coin is that what we might see with a decrease in demand, especially in that Black Sea region where we're seeing the war take place, and with Ukrainian farmers perhaps not being able to go through the regular production cycle. And we expect to see likely lower fertilizer demand. So we go on to the last piece, and that's looking at more specific trade issues and the anti-dumping cases that have been brought by a couple of companies, Mosaic for phosphorus related phosphate fertilizers coming out of Russia and Morocco. These cases have already been decided by the US ITC and the Department of Commerce. And those countries, and more specifically, companies out of those countries have been assigned duties. So there are certain cash deposits that have to be made on exports coming from those particular companies out of those countries. So that's, I guess we can read into that, that's likely increased the overall global phosphorus price if we want to get to the specifics. And the anti-dumping case that was brought by CF Industries primarily against companies out of Russia and Trinidad, that is very likely going to be finalized, and that the Department of Commerce has issued affirmative preliminary determinations in this case. So these countervailing duties are already in place for the most part, and likely will be finalized and will be in effect for the next 5 years as those determinations are made. So that has probably already worked its way into the marketplace and being accounted for with the prices that we're seeing. However, we're going to continue to see that upward pressure on prices due to some of these countervailing duties into the near future. And the last point that's been getting a lot of discussion is how much of these increases in fertilizer prices is due to profit taking by the companies that are in power, if you will, those companies that have significant market share. And I think you could argue that at least a portion of these prices that we're experiencing, the increases are due to some profit taking in the sector. Okay, so let's go to the next one then, and just, I guess, share at least some of the data from at least one source, the Fertilizer Institute, citing that the Russian exports of fertilizer, they account for 23% of ammonia, 14% of urea, 21% of the potash, and 10% of the processed phosphate exports. So a significant share of the global export market that perhaps may be disrupted. Not that a lot of that flows to North America, but it does go to certain other countries. And part of the reason why we may not see a huge disruption is a lot of that the product does flow south for them into the India and Chinese markets and other Southeast Asian countries. So we'll see how much total impact, but whenever there's a disruption in trade and or constriction in certain market channels, it typically doesn't help overall global prices. Okay, so we go to the next slide then, and that's looking at a couple of these next two are looking at the stock prices of a couple of primary or major fertilizer companies. We've gotten questions, and I know that producers are always looking at ways to hedge risk. And with run up in fertilizer prices, one of the ways that we might have been able to hedge risk if we had purchased fertilizer stock, and going back to perhaps a year ago, I know that this is one of those situations where it's too late as we stand now, but in the future, without any futures exchanges for fertilizer products, we don't have those. We can perhaps utilize fertilizer stocks as a type of hedge against volatile fertilizer prices. So as fertilizer prices go up, typically we see a correlation with some of these companies' stocks. So we would in ownership of that stock, be able to hedge some of our risk and participate in that rally as an owner of that stock. So that's the Mosaic stock. Here's the CF Industries, also a significant increase in last year. And then we'll go on to the next slide, and we'll talk about overall what our budgets are going to look like. Right now, as I've shared in the last few months, significant increases in costs, as I think that's the worst kept secret in agriculture right now. It's significantly increased from last year. And we go and look at the specific ones, and I think corn is the first one I have here as far as the actual budget numbers. So we'll go to the next slide, and we look at where we stand now. And we've had some, even since a couple of days ago when I put these updates together, we've had some volatility in crop prices. But roughly, if we look at December futures for this next year, we can get somewhere close to 6.25 per bushel. If we look at trend yield in Ohio of around 183, look at all of our expenses that we have accounted for, we can go down here and look at our returns above variable cost around $500. Now, that number sounds good, but we have to pay for all of our fixed costs or our ownership or our overhead costs out of that. It gets eaten up pretty quickly. So I guess the total message, however, is that the 6.25 corn, and we know that this may not be our average for what we might be able to get at the farm gate, but right now it's fairly attractive, and it does offer at least the potential for some profitability for this next year. So we go and take a look at soybeans. That's next, and we can get in the neighborhood of 1450 for this next fall delivery. We look at November futures minus some basis, and we look at all of our costs, and we go down here, returns to variable costs, somewhere in the neighborhood of the corn number, around $500, just a little north of that per acre. So we look at wheat. This has been one of the more volatile ones, and right now we may be this has bounced up and down in the last couple of days. Somewhere in the high 9s per bushel for wheat we could get for summer delivery. If we look at the September wheat futures at Chicago and the 73 bushel wheat, and we're somewhere around $430 per acre, and that doesn't include any straw or double crop return. So that, I guess if anything, this is maybe an argument to keep those wheat acres, even if they may not be as good as what you might normally expect them to be. Okay, so following this is the next slide, and we look at the comparisons of the three, and we look at corn, soybeans, and wheat at these respective prices. And again, I know that these may not be the actual averages that you get at the farm, but we can capture essentially these prices now if we were to forward contract everything, knowing that that's not always the case or very seldom is. But we can see the returns and then the returns to land. So even with all these really high prices or high costs that we're going to have to deal with, these higher commodity prices will, in I think most situations, allow for some profitability on Ohio commodity crop acres this year. providing we see these prices stay where they are. One thing on taxes, we had a notice out on the 15th, so 2 or 3 days ago. And this is primarily for farmers that are S Corp shareholders, but this now extends to all farmers, allowing you to extend your filing deadline to April 18th. So if you were at March 1st and you were having to file due to not paying any estimated taxes, and if you were a few days late, you will not have to pay, or you can get a refund for any kinds of penalties that you might have paid. This was done primarily to give relief to those farmers that were S Corp shareholders due to the fact that some of the forms weren't finalized in a timely manner, and S Corps then didn't have the opportunity to share that information with the shareholders. So this is just an extension of the deadline. And this year, due to the fact that April 15th is falling on an odd date on the weekend, we extended out to April 18th. So those of you, and me included, that are procrastinators, we have 2 or 3 extra days to file our federal and then, of course, state taxes. So this is a nice notice. Okay, so the next and the last slide is just a note and a reminder about our custom rate survey. So if you have the opportunity, we would love for you to share your information. I know most of you, even though this is a 4-page survey and then the online version is several different pages, many of you only have 2 or 3 custom work rates that you pay for or you provide for your neighbors, perhaps. Just share what you have, and we're very grateful to get all the data that we can. We're only conducting this survey every other year now, so we're expecting to see these numbers probably increase a little bit due to increased costs across the board with labor, machinery costs, and also fuel costs. But it'll be useful, and I know many perhaps that are on this call will use that data then in turn. So with that, I will conclude and turn it over to Sing Key, and we're happy to have him with us.
Okay, thank you, Barry, and good morning, everyone. I'm Sing-Kee Lee. I'm an assistant professor in AED department, and I'm going to talk about the grain marketing outlook today. So let's get started. Here, the first look of the current market is the price increase. The right graph shows the US inflation rate since 1990. And as shown, we are seeing the highest inflation rate within 3 decades. Specifically, Bureau of Labor Statistics announced this month that the US inflation during the February was unfortunately was 7.9%. And many analysts expect we will see a high inflation rate for March as well. So maybe this trend will continue for a while. There are several factors explaining the current market move. Without surprise, the existing inflation pressure and supply chain issue after COVID are still affecting. Also, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and South America production shortfalls are additionally raising many prices related to agriculture. Although commodity price rally itself can be a bullish signal, as many input and raw materials become getting more and more expensive at the same time, various perspectives are mixed to some extent. Let me talk a little more about the grain market's response to the invasion of Ukraine. The graph shows the future price index for several major crops. All prices are normalized by January 3rd price level. So daily futures prices are divided by the January 3rd price of each crop. So and when we look at the gray area, we can see the movement of future prices after the outbreak of Russian invasion of Ukraine. So as we can see, the US wheat, Black Sea wheat, and corn all showed significant increases as a response to the war in Ukraine. Specifically in early March, US wheat reached about 70% higher than its start price of the year. Now, still, it is more than 40% higher than the January price. The corn futures price is also about 25% higher than its January price. Soybean futures price went sideways during this period, implying maybe less direct impact of the war in Ukraine on the soybean market. So from this figure, we can see the extent how much each commodity was affected by the war in the breadbasket of Europe. Now let's take a look at what USDA updated for the corn in their March WASDE report. I highlighted specific changes from the February report. First, when looking at the bottom row, the season average price has been increased from $5.45 per bushel to $5.65 per bushel, so 20 cents up. And this can be explained by demand shifts. First, the ethanol corn demand was adjusted up by 25 million bushels, and the export forecast was ramped up by 75 million bushels. These are reflections of the potential shock in the supply chain across the board due to the war in Ukraine. Lastly, for the 22-23 season production, USDA projected a small drop in corn area, expecting 92 million acres in total, but an increase in production volume based on the yield. But they also projected an increase in production volume based on the yield improvement. Of course, we need to take it with a grain of salt because USDA still didn't reflect the effect of Russia-Ukraine war when they are making this 22-23 forecast. So this may be updated quite a bit later on. And this is a summary of world corn production. Last month, USDA reduced Brazil's corn production due to drought issues there. And this month, Argentina was updated. Despite those reductions, world corn production itself continues to hit the record levels. Specifically, the March update was mainly driven by India, shown at the bottom of this table. Additionally, in fact, second crop corn, which takes 70% of Brazilian corn, will be harvested as of May. So Brazil still has some good production potential, and that is why still we see some bright prospects of global corn supply. I'd like to highlight Ukraine as well. Of course, Ukraine's 21-22 marketing year harvest was already done last year, so the production itself did not change, but we should be mindful that there is a huge uncertainty whether the harvest crop can be effectively distributed. So it is not about the production itself, but more about the logistics. And speaking a little more about Ukraine's crop production, Ukraine has been increasing its corn production for several years. And now Ukraine is fourth largest corn exporter following US, Brazil, and Argentina in the global market. As shown in the right figure, Ukraine farmers had a successful harvest last year. This implies, obviously, the export loss from Ukraine due to the war influenced the market in a very unique way. The export shift and price response we see now are not because of typical shortage of supply or excess demand, but mostly because of frictions in logistics. That is why it is hard to simply say the US export shift is showing pure bullish prospects. It can easily disappear or even go opposite direction at some point. So we should be careful about that. For soybeans, USDA only changed exports and price. As shown at the bottom of the right table, the season average price was updated from $13 per bushel to $13.25 per bushel. Export increase was the main reason, of course, and this is the consequence of the production problem in South America. Additionally, USDA projected the soybean acreage for 22-23 season as 88 million acres, which is a slight increase from 21-22 season. Again, this number does not reflect the war in Ukraine. I expect their prospective planting report, which will be released at the end of this month. In that report, we will see more precise estimates about the acreage forecast. This is a table showing the production estimates of major soybean producing countries. I highlighted Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. In fact, most of the foreign production change was attributable to the decrease in these three countries for this month. Paraguay is especially estimated to produce 46.5% less soybean than last year. And quantity-wise, Brazil shows an outstanding drop. It is estimated to decrease by 11 million metric tons, which is 8% drop from the last year. People anticipate about 90% of the export loss of Brazil can be potential extra demand for US crops. So this might be generating some opportunities for US farmers. Now let's briefly check the world weather. For the US, drought issues which started last December remain a large concern, especially to the western states and some parts of western Corn Belt states. The dry conditions make it easier to plant, but crops eventually will need moisture. So this is still pretty concerning. Globally, during February, many regions also suffered from drought, which escalated concerns of supply shortage. Fortunately, the drought concern became a bit lowered during March. So this is the March map, and the map shows the summary of global weather released this week. During the last 2 weeks, many major crop producing region had a favorable weather, as we can see. Specifically, after the severe drought during February, South American countries are having good amount of rain, which will help their production progress. This may be reflected as an adjustment in the global production estimates later. Here's my last slide. We are facing a high volatile market now. So some parts are covered by classic economics, with supply and demand, but the other factor, the war, is really making anything can happen. So the market swing will likely continue even if the war ends shortly, which is the best case scenario. So I want to emphasize a few traditional pulse of wisdoms against a volatile market. First off, of course, you should stay on top of up-to-date market information. And strategy-wise, I'd recommend prioritizing taking care of downside risks, specifically when calculating the expected returns, putting extra weights on the worst cases and checking the risk-adjusted expected profits can be one example. Lastly, I want to remind a couple of items to be stressed for the 22-23 season. First, as input costs are getting harder to manage, looking around feasible cost saving strategies would be potentially valuable a lot, which was well addressed in Barry's presentation today. Second item is crop insurance and maybe some other like government programs that can support farmers. Although price rarely gets crop insurance less paid attention, still it can effectively protect farmers' net profit if the market moves against their position. Third, a fair question to ask would be the potential impact of the war on the Ukraine production for the 22-23 season. In fact, we are approaching the deadline by nature. As we can see in the right picture, many major crops, including corn, are supposed to be planted as of April in Ukraine. So if the war doesn't end until March or even like April, there should be some substantial drop in Ukraine's grain production, and this will definitely affect the next marketing year. So from a far-sighted perspective, what's happening in Ukraine will be continuously very important. Okay, I think that is all of my presentation.
Okay, well, I think I'm up next. Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm going to address long-term care cost. This is a issue for many farmers in Ohio. We get a lot of questions about, how big a risk are long-term care costs? What do we do about it? What kind of risk do they present to farming operations? So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the issue. In future sessions, we may go over some more details and get into more in depth on some strategies. But today I just wanted to introduce the topic to you. So first we'll start out with some cost, and this survey is done by Genworth. They're a insurance and financial company that does a lot of work in the long-term care industry, and these are their survey numbers. So as you can see, Ohio is a little bit lower than the national average, so that's the good news. The bad news is it's still very expensive. So a full nursing home room in Ohio will be, I usually use 80 to 90,000, could be upwards of 100,000. It depends on where you go. Smaller towns, more rural areas tend to have a lower cost. You get into Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, the costs will tend to be higher. So the location of the facility does matter. And even assisted living, which isn't full nursing home care, is still $50,000 to $55,000. Average stay in the nursing home, I see a lot of different numbers for this. So 2.2 seems to be kind of in the middle. Some numbers will be as low as a little over 1, some numbers as high. One factor that definitely affects this number is gender. Women will tend to be in nursing homes longer than men, primarily because women have longer life expectancy to men. And I know every time I've been in a nursing home, it seems like there are a lot more women than men there. So as we look at Medicaid and nursing home cost, gender definitely plays a part in that. So those for the current cost. Where were we? Where are we going? Well, not surprisingly, costs are going to go up. That's almost a certainty. So by the end of the decade, is projected to be at 125,000. So this issue is not going away. It's likely to get more acute in the future. So it's definitely an issue that Ohio producers ought to address and see what kind of plan they can implement. So some more statistics, 7 out of 10 people will require long-term care. Again, this is from the same survey that I mentioned before. Now, this doesn't mean all 7 people are going to be in a nursing home for 2 to 4 years. Many people go to a nursing home for recovery or therapy or rehabilitation from an illness or a medical procedure. So again, yeah, 7 out of 10 people will require long-term care, but it may not be years long. It could be weeks or a few months. So my next question there, 10 years ago, I would have said estate taxes are the biggest threat to transferring a viable farming operation to the next generation. State tax laws have gotten much more favorable over the last few years. So in my opinion, I do think long-term care costs probably are the biggest threat, at least definitely the biggest financial threat to passing on along a farming operation. So the question becomes, if somebody goes into a nursing home, is there $90,000 of extra income to pay for a nursing home? If not, is there savings to pay for nursing home? If the savings run out, or maybe there's no savings at all, then the next question becomes, what assets will be sold to pay for nursing home cost? And if assets are sold, does that affect the viability of the farming operation? In many cases, it does. So let's talk about Medicaid. And the first point I want to make is Medicaid and Medicare are different programs. Most people know that, but some people get it confused. Medicare is primarily health care for older people. Medicaid is primarily health care for people that don't have the resources to pay for their care. Medicaid is a part state and part federal government program, and funded jointly by states and federal. The reason Medicaid comes into this discussion is many people know that Medicaid will pay for nursing home care. So the question becomes, if I run out of my savings, will Medicaid pay for my care? And that question is yes, if you qualify, but that's a big issue. So let's look at what it takes to qualify for Medicaid. So like I said before, Medicaid primarily is for people that do not have the resources to pay for their own medical care. And these are the eligibility limits, the financial limits that we use in Ohio. Each state, because it's partly a state program, each state has different qualifications. So if you're in another state, these numbers may not apply to you, but they're probably close. But to be eligible for Medicaid, you cannot have more than $2,500 of income a month. Easily gotten around. You can set up a special kind of trust, and the extra income goes into the trust, and then the trustee pays nursing home care. So income limit isn't that big of a deal. The big deal is asset limits. So for a single person, they cannot own more than $2,000 of assets and be eligible for Medicaid. Married persons total can own about $140,000 of total assets. There are some exempt assets. So for example, someone's residence is exempt. So let's say it's a married person and one spouse is in the nursing home and the other spouse is still living in the house. That house is exempt, meaning it is not required to be sold to pay for nursing home care. So houses, land around the houses, vehicles, personal items are not required to be sold. But the problem is there's still a state recovery. So even though the house isn't required to be sold while someone's in the nursing home, after both spouses have passed away, the state can and likely will come in and require that house to be sold and get payment then from it. So exempt assets are not safe assets. It's just deferring the issue until after death. So with those numbers, you can see very few farmers will qualify for Medicaid without aggressive planning. I mean, just a few acres of ownership will disqualify for Medicaid. So difficult to qualify for Medicaid, but we'll look at some strategies to pursue if that's where you want to go. So if you exceed the asset limitation, what is the strategy? Well, really the only strategy is those assets have to get out of your ownership in your control. You cannot own them, you cannot control them. So I've had clients that, you know, will come in and say, well, I want to protect the land from nursing home cost. How do I do that? And I'll say, well, you've got to give up total ownership and control of the assets. You've got to give them to somebody else or put them in an irrevocable trust. You can't control them anymore. And that tends to make people really think if that's the strategy they want to go to. It is difficult to give up ownership and control of assets that you may have, you know, built up over your life, and especially for farmers, giving up control of their land can be especially difficult. So it's a challenge to do, and that's why there are no easy solutions to long-term care planning. The next point, the 5-year look back. This is probably the biggest impediment to easy planning for Medicaid. And what this is Medicaid says, if you make gifts, then you are ineligible for a certain amount of time. So for each 7,000 or so, and that number changes each year. So for each $7,000 or so of gifts you make in the last 5 years, then you're ineligible for 1 month. So $100,000 gift will cause 14 months of ineligibility. However, the ineligibility is capped at 5 years. So a $1 million gift does not cause 140 months of eligibility. It's capped at 60 months or 5 years. The purpose of this rule is that if we didn't have a look back period, many people who are going in the nursing home tomorrow would give all their assets away today and then just rely on Medicaid, and the system would be overwhelmed immediately and likely be insolvent. So it probably is a necessary rule, but it's a rule that certainly makes planning challenging, because any Medicaid long-term care planning really needs to be done 5 years in advance, and you know, 5 years ahead of time as far as health issues and needing care issues. So makes it challenging. I think I've already covered some of these. So challenges qualifying for Medicaid, again, give up ownership and control, and that's difficult for a lot of people. A couple other challenges is you may not have control as to what facility you go to. Not all long-term care facilities accept Medicaid. So you may have a facility that, you know, you'd like to go to, but if you're on Medicaid, you know, maybe you're just not eligible to go there. Likely cannot be in a private room. You'd be in a semi-private room, which is usually 2 people. And then I've got a moral dilemma with a question mark. Some people have a dilemma of giving all their assets away and then, you know, going on a government program for their care. Other people have the mindset of, I paid into Medicaid my whole life, I've paid taxes my whole life, you know, it's time for my tax dollars to work for me, so Medicaid should pay for my care. Both legitimate ideas, but for some people, it is an issue and maybe a reason not to try to qualify for Medicaid. So what are some strategies for long-term care cost? One strategy is do nothing, and I don't put this up here flippantly or in a way to try to make light of anything. Most people don't have the resources to set up an irrevocable trust, or, they don't have the income where they can give all their assets away and still, be able to live. So that's the most common strategy. And some people just play the odds. Odds are, you're not going to go into a nursing home for a long time. So let's play the odds and do nothing. Another strategy, gift assets to family, and it can be anybody, but typically it's family. So you gift your assets away, you don't keep any ownership or control, and then after 5 years, those assets are safe from nursing home cost. Irrevocable trusts, similar strategy in that you essentially gift your assets into an irrevocable trust, and once you put them in the trust, you can't change the trust, you can't ever get those assets back, and you give up full control. The advantage of an irrevocable trust is you can put some conditions on the inheritance, like somebody has to be 25 years old to receive their share, or maybe they can't sell the land for 20 years, something like that. Long-term care insurance. So this is my preferred strategy for long-term care costs, but the issue is not everybody can afford long-term care insurance. Premiums can be expensive, although there's a lot of different policies and creative policies out there. So before you just assume you can't afford long-term care insurance, talk to your financial advisor or insurance agent and see if maybe there's some creative way that it will fit into your budget. And the other issue there is some people are not insurable. So if you've got many pre-existing conditions, you may not be insurable. Long-term care is not like healthcare where you have to, insurance companies have to insure over existing issues. Long-term care does not have that same obligation. And self-insure, save up money, and if you have to go in the nursing home, I'm setting aside this money to pay for my care. The problem there is, how much do you need? How much should you save? And also, it's money that you could otherwise be putting into your farm or business and growing that business instead of setting it aside. The main point here is there are no easy solutions. Each one of those strategies I discussed has significant disadvantages. And sometime in the future, we'll go into each of those strategies in more detail and talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So that's all I had. If anybody has any questions, I'll stay on till the end and address any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Robert. We're glad to have you back here at Ohio State.
Thanks.
Now it's my turn. And Wednesday night at our first Farm Office Live this week, David shared his crocus that had already bloomed. And this morning we had daffodils. So I thought I'd share those with you very early, especially for Northeast Ohio. Over here where we're just in spitting distance from Pennsylvania. So I appreciate the opportunity. This morning, we're going to dig into some of our farm business analysis numbers a little deeper. We are currently doing analysis work for 2021. So the numbers we look at today are for 2020. And we first started looking at the crop specialized farms in November. And just a reminder, as you look at the shaded counties on the Ohio map here, these are the counties that we have data for that we're using. While we had 51 farms enroll, 24 of those completed a crop enterprise analysis and are very focused on crop production. So they're selling semi-loads of grain and doing some very specific marketing for grain crops. So when we first took a look at these, we focused on the liquidity and solvency of these farms and just wanted to pop this back up here to get our minds back in this groove. And as we look at the 2 years in 2020, we have 24 farms, averaged 1,043 acres, and that range goes from in less than 500 to over 1,500. And in 2019, we had some more farms that got it completed, literally about the same acreage there. But where we really saw some differences here in 2020 was in the cash position of those farms. And while it's not all exactly the same farms, we do see that current ratio at 3.52 is extremely strong, up from just under 2 the year before. When we look at absolute working capital dollars, definitely more. But what really tells the story, what the adequacy of that working capital for the size of the farm, averaged 52.6%, which is really good for all farms, and 35%, which was good in 2019. And overall solvency of those businesses, an improvement there as well, 21% in 2020. So today we're going to focus on the financial efficiency measures for these farms, and these 5 items are what we're going to focus on. The first one is asset turnover rate, and that's at a cost valuation. So when we're looking at the assets, it's not the market valuation of those assets. That can, as we know, just looking at land prices, the dollar value of those assets can go up or down. But at this point, we're seeing up with both land values and the strength in the machinery markets, machinery and equipment markets. So we use the cost valuation, and what that means is what you paid for it. So the land on that balance sheet is going to be in at what you paid for it. The machinery and equipment will be on your balance sheet at what you paid for it, less an accumulated economic depreciation. So nothing to do how taxes are managed. But for machinery and equipment, each year they're going to be depreciated at 7%, titled vehicles at 15%, and buildings and improvements at 5%. So trying to represent that use, wear, tear, obsolescence of using that machinery and equipment inventory in the production of the crops that are sold. So when we're looking at this and benchmarking against this greater than 45%, it is outside of what is happening in the market in terms of appreciation or depreciation of assets based on markets and demands. So for 2020, our farms averaged 25.4%. So not where we'd like to see it. We'd like to see that at greater than 45%. And there's a number of reasons that can be that way. It's comparing the value of assets to the value of production. So when grain prices are low, we're going to see some higher asset turnover rates. And we'll look at that a little more closely in a second. The next 4 we're going to look at are really a package. I like to think of them as a package deal, and that'll be easy to visualize here shortly. But just looking at the average of all farms, operating expense ratio, or how much of the gross returns are taken up or eaten up by operating expenses, 66.3%. Excuse me. So we'd like to see that at less than 60. Depreciation expense, that cost-based depreciation I mentioned up here at asset turnover rate, 7.5%. We'd like to see it at less than 5. Interest expense ratio here, these last 2 are a little closer to the benchmarks that we like to achieve over here on the right-hand column. So interest expense ratio, how much of the gross returns are committed to paying interest, 4.1%. So we are under this less than 5% benchmark. And finally, the net farm income ratio, or what do we get to keep to pay, generate returns for any unpaid labor and management, to pay income tax liabilities, to reinvest in the business, et cetera. We'd really like to see that be the biggest chunk. But at 22%, we did get above this greater than 20% benchmark that we have for that. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail and how they look across farms. So the first one, the financial efficiency, tried to illustrate a little bit here what we're looking at. So if we have all of the assets of the business, the dollar value of all those assets, so inventories, grain and storage, supplies, prepaids, machinery and equipment, land, et cetera, those are our assets. And then we're comparing the value of farm production. So that would be the accrual adjusted gross returns. And if there are livestock, we'd be subtracting purchase feed from that. But most of these are strictly grain farms. So it's going to look very much like the accrual adjusted gross returns. So what's the proportion of that? Our benchmark, we were looking at wanting to see that at 45% or so. And so that would mean that this value of farm production should be about 45% or more of the value of these assets. So at our average, we were, just barely tweaking it in there. That would be our benchmark, would be greater than 45%. Now, what did our farms actually do? The columns we have here, the average of all farms is our first one. So that's the first number we looked at. So instead of this 45, we're kind of way down here for our farms. But then let's see if we see any differences based on farm size. So our second column are the 5 farms that were between 100 and 500 acres. This third column between 500 and 1,000 acres, and that was our largest group of farms. There were 8 of those. 5 farms that had between 1,000 and 1,500 acres, and then there were 6 that were greater than 1,500 acres. And we didn't see a lot of variation. They were pretty consistent in terms of the proportion of income that they generated relative to all the assets they had tied up in producing those grain crops. The last 4 we're going to look at, this package of 4 efficiency ratios, I kind of think of in terms of Pac-Man, and the operating expense ratio looks very much like Pac-Man some years. Last year, it very much did. So we have all the gross returns of the farm over here, and then we're going to look and see how they got eaten up, basically. And our first one is going to be the operating expense ratio, and that's the one that can very much look like Pac-Man. And I'm really happy to say it looks much better this year than it did last year. Our average was 66.3%, and comparing that to 2019, the average that year was 76%. So 10% more of the returns were consumed by simply the operating expenses, what it cost to get that crop in the ground and off the ground into storage or to the market. And we see the first 3 farm sizes are fairly close together, 62, 63, 61%. And just the same as it was last year, it's the largest farm size that a greater percent of those acres are taken up by the operating expenses. We'd like to see these at less than 60%. That said, benchmarks are affected by the markets, what we're probably going to see. And if we remember 22 and 2019, those weren't particularly high crop price years. I think for some crops, as we look at the average price received for these crops with the analysis, 2020 was a little better than 2019. And that too can definitely impact the gross revenues. So even if you were selling the same amount of product as the previous year, if you're getting more per unit, we should see the operating expense ratio on average is going to decline. So I would expect these as we look, actually it's going to be interesting to see what they look like for 2022, because we're going to have much higher prices, but those input costs are certainly have us all concerned at this point. So our next bite out of our gross farm returns is depreciation. So while this is not a cash cost per se, you don't get a bill for that's labeled depreciation. We do, in ongoing businesses, need to recognize that we're putting wear and tear on machinery and equipment. So over time that has to be replaced. So we do need to be generating enough dollars to replace those regularly over time. We'd like to see that less than 5%. Our average was 7.5%, and you can see how that was divided up across farm sizes, with our biggest chunk coming out of the 1,500 acre farms or higher. You know, on an individual farm basis, this is going to be heavily influenced by how much machinery and equipment is owned and operated by the farm business and the age of that complement of machinery. Our third bite is interest. So when we looked at operating expenses, our biggest chunks here, those did not include the interest expenses. And for nearly all of the efficiency measures we calculate and many of those farm financial standards measures, interest is subtracted from operating expenses or net farm income, depending on what we're looking at. And there's a very good reason for that. If we leave that in, those numbers then that are results of those calculations are influenced by how much debt the farm is carrying. And so for benchmarking, that adds some variation in there that we can control by not including the interest expense there, but looking at it, certainly it's part of the whole picture, but the individual benchmarks aren't impacted by how much debt each farm business has. So that's why it's separated out here. And you can see it can be more than twice as much from one farm size to the next. So our smallest farms had 3% of their gross returns committed to paying interest obligations, so less than 5%. Our next farm size of 500 to 1,000, same thing. They were well under that 5%. And our two larger farm sizes were both at that 5%. Now that does mean that within these groups, there would be some that were higher and some that were lower. For those higher, then what that means is there's less, you know, say this farm was at 8%, then there's less available for this last chunk. And as we look at the last bite, we'll be looking at how much is left that's considered net farm income. And just a reminder, net farm income is not the same thing as family living. It's the dollars that are available for family living. If it's a sole proprietorship, it is also the dollars that are available to generate a return to unpaid labor. It is dollars that have to be used to make any principal payments that the farm has committed to, and they have to be used to pay any income tax obligations, which we hope that the farm over time is profitable enough that there are tax obligations that can then be managed. So we'd like to see 20% at least left for those obligations. And our average was 22. So that was a big improvement from the year before, where it was only averaged 11%. And you can see how that was divided across farm size. The largest amounts left were in these three smaller farm sizes, lesser amount for the larger farms. And so while the absolute dollars might be larger for this larger farm group, the dollars needed for principal payments, et cetera, could be potentially larger also. So just, I think a helpful way for me to look at it is just to look at it in these pies and see how they compare to one another. This is not probably, those liquidity and solvency measures are the first ones I would look at on farms. But these, as a farm gets into analysis and really digging into their financial performance and efficiency, these are some important ones to look at as well. And they are ones that will continue to be there when we shift to the Baker's dozen of the farm financial standards next year. Those will be in play. As a wrap up here today, just wanted to remind you that this is the time of year to do farm business analysis, and we have our team out there working across the state. And I really wanted to point out to you that we have a position that just posted this week. The information is down here. If you know anyone or yourself might be interested in doing some farm business analysis work, it's really fun to some of us. But it is a part-time position. We do the bulk of our work between January and June. It's part-time, flexible hours within that because our technicians work when they have the data has been provided to them by farms. This position, we want to focus their work in Northwest Ohio, but we are a very virtual group. So for instance, we have farms across Ohio that work with Christina, who's our most experienced technician. And so the person will be working virtually as well. In addition to, we do go to some events and do some promotion work and spend some time at Farm Science Review. But it's a good job that's a really nice fit for some folks who want some flexibility and not full-time work. So be glad to answer any questions there. And you can always find our previous analysis summaries at Farm Profitability and through Farm Office. So David, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Diana. And I have to say, I love the addition of the Pac-Man slide today with the eating all the money up. That was.
I've been going to do that, and I thought I just got to get it done.
Yeah, it's great. So last month, appreciate that. I love the fact that you're sneaking in slides and daffodils, and I have another crocus picture to show you today. But last month, Jeff did a really good job of showing us the Farm Office Live website, and we had some good reaction on the evaluations to that. So today we'd like to take a peek at one of our favorite partner organizations, and that's a farm service agency. Of course, I think many that are on the call understand and appreciate the work that the Farm Service Agency does, but we wanted to kind of take a peek to give you a look at their website, as well as how you can negotiate in to find the information on fact sheets on all the different programs that are out there for the Farm Service Agency. One thing as far as the county level, you can see this beautiful colored map. Understand that not every county has their own Farm Service Agency office. For instance, if you look far up in the far northeast to the Ashtabula, Lake Geauga, you see those are all purple. That means that is one office that is co-located there in Orwell, Ohio, in the southwest part of Ashtabula County that services the farmers in Lake Geauga and Ashtabula. You come down to the east central part of the state where I am in Coshocton County. You can see Mike Jacob is our FSA executive director, and we have our own county office here, but he also is covering Holmes, which is vacant. And then over to our friends in Franklin and Pickaway County. Again, that's a dual county office. It's located in Pickaway County. But of course, any of these programs that we kind of share with you, if you have questions about what they do, don't hesitate to go into your local office to look. Now, some of the programs that we'll be talking about as we move forward in Farm Office Lives, we'll talk about some of the farm loan programs that the Farm Service Agency stands up. And those folks are more in a regional center. And so you can kind of see this color coded map for the regional Farm Service Agency farm loan contacts. And you can, if you were going to go into one of the farm loans, you would be going into those regional offices for that. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we're going to here, and I'm going to give you a different share. Kind of want to go to the website and actually share the website. And there you can see, as you go on to log on to fsa.usda.gov, you can see the front page for the Farm Service Agency office. Of course, they'll talk about the coronavirus and USDA assistance. You scroll down, it won't be long before we're talking about the Farm Bill. You can see the Farm Bill link there. If you're interested in the national program deadlines, we already mentioned that we have gone by the ARC and PLC program deadlines here on March 15th, but mention if I click on that, you can see as it pops up, we already mentioned the two most pressing deadlines that are coming up, the dairy margin coverage deadline, as well as the spot market hog pandemic program deadline of April 29th. So you can always check to see when those program deadlines are by clicking on that link. There's the farmers.gov. That is where we at Farm Office Live have spent a lot of time the past 2 years, it seems like, going to this page, the farmers.gov. Anything that is there with pandemic assistance for producers, all those programs can be found here for information, as well as any news releases. So it's kind of our one-stop shop when it comes to the pandemic programs that had been rolled out and continue to be rolled out. And then you can see down at the bottom, there is an Ask the USDA button. So if you want to ask the USDA some questions, and crop acreage reporting is there, as well as we've talked about this in the past. There's an update for those small socially disadvantaged farmers. The American Rescue Plan, of course, had proposed that the USDA pay off 120% of the loan balances for socially disadvantaged farmers. But of course, we know that is in legislation right now in the court system. So we continue to monitor that. So as you go to the top, I kind of like to show you from left to right. If you click on these buttons, you can see in the FSA, they stand up a ton of programs. Mentioned the ARC PLC program deadline that was earlier this week, but you can see the farm loan programs. If I hover over that, I could connect into all the loan programs that are out there. There's a Farm Bill Home, margin protection program for dairy. That's Diane's love. She'll spend time there. We had talked about market facilitation program through the pandemic. Also, we have mentioned the organic certification cost share programs and some of those that have been unrolled. So those information sheets, they have specific home landing pages for each of those. Of course, state offices, we know that here in Ohio, how to grab that, the online services. But the one I really wanted to show you is the newsroom. Because if you click on the newsroom, the really nice part of this newsroom is if you come over to this button called the fact sheets. Now, this is the portal. This is your entrance into a lot of the fact sheets. And the FSA has just some tremendous fact sheets to explain the different programs. So for producers, they say, am I eligible? Am I not? The last couple of months, we've talked about the farm storage loan program, where many producers thought, well, that's just for if I want to build a grain bed. No, there's a whole host of items there in that loan program that could be applicable. For instance, like a cold storage for a small fruit vegetable producer. But you can see as I scroll down there, and when it gets to the commodities, income safety net programs, the information is there. We talked about the margin protection program for dairy, market facilitation program, all that is there. If you go down to the conservation reserve program, again, there's a lot of management sheets there. As I continue to scroll, you can see a lot more. There's the entire lineup for the dairy programs, disaster recovery, just a fact sheet even there on acreage reporting. And then you keep going down, there's a spot for energy, environmental activities for fish. And then in some general information, you get to some livestock and goes into the farm loans, where there's a tremendous amount of loan programs for producers to tap into, lower interest loans, and especially for our beginner farmers, our socially disadvantaged farmers, our smaller producers like the micro loans. If you wanted to learn more about the micro loans, which are the smaller loans, a lot easier, a lot less paperwork. I want to say it's easier, a lot less paperwork for the folks to go through to get a microloan, but you can see the fact sheets that are there that producers can check out to learn how to apply and find out more information about the microloan. So the FSA, kudos to them. They have a really sweet website and for new farmers, organic producers, specialty crops, you name it. When you get to this one section there, and I hope Jeff has put this fact sheet index right there in the chat box, because there's just so many resources there for you as producers. So that's kind of a quick look at their website. And I'm going to go back to the share of my PowerPoint slide. Okay, that should have popped up again. That's where we started on the website. Just as a reminder that there's eligibility parameters for each of the programs that the Farm Service Agency offers. Some of those include the adjusted gross income levels for the sheet. And I know producers that were making their ARC PLC elections had to again verify their adjusted gross income. And of course, there's the conservation compliance. We want to be good stewards of our land and not violate any wetlands concern or the highly erodible land. But just a few definitions. Beginner farmer is anyone who's operated a farm for less than 10 years and that they materially and substantially participate. And this is a commercial operation. So this is for under 10 years. And then limited resource. And again, these definitions are important based on your eligibility. For instance, in the farm loan programs may mean if you fall in one category versus the other, the interest rate might be a tick lower. So for limited resource, farmer or rancher, you earn no more than $177,300 than each of the 2 calendar years. And there's a big word and. Do you have a household income that's below the national poverty level for a family of 4 or less than 50% of the county median household income? So that's a limited resource. Socially disadvantaged is for a member of a group who's have been subject to some type of racial, ethnic, or gender prejudice because of their identity. So you can see the list there. It includes Asian and Asian Americans, Black African Americans, Native Hawaiians, Hispanics, and even women. But just know in some of the programs, women will not follow under the definition of socially disadvantaged. So you have to kind of read each program to see in which category it might be applicable. And a veteran, of course, we appreciate all the all of our veterans that have served our country. And in the days like we are today, it makes us even appreciate our veterans even more. But under the definition for veteran farmers, in the Farm Service Agency programs, that is a new veteran who is operating a farm for less than 10 years and has obtained their first obtained status of veteran during the most recent 10-year period. So we look back and maybe someone who served in Vietnam and they start into the farming operation and it's less than 10 years, but they served in the Vietnam War, but they didn't obtain the veteran status within the past 10 years. They wouldn't be eligible as a veteran under the program, but of course be eligible under some of the other small and beginner farmer type of definitions. So the definitions are key with any governmental program. And that's why we kind of wanted to take a quick peek at the Farm Service Agency. I know many of us feel really indebted to the work that the Farm Service Agency has done, especially over the last 2 years. Not only were they executing the traditional programs that we're also used to, but there were so many ad hoc programs that came out, first with the trade issues with China, and then as we moved into the pandemic times that we were in. So we just appreciate and tip our hats from OSU Extension to the Farm Service Agency. We really appreciate the work that they do. And with that, we're right up on our time. I'm not seeing any new questions in the Q&A, but I didn't know. And Diane showed her daffodils. Well, this is the crocus, and we have a really purple one that is ready to bloom this weekend, Diane. So I'll have to send you a picture of that. But spring is in the air. No, we still haven't had our 3 snows after the forsythias had bloomed. So we may know there's still some bumps in the road as we go forward, but we can tell that spring is near. And as spring is near, just want to remind you on April 20th is our next Farm Office Live. That's in the evening from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And before we close, I want to open it up to Diane or Barry or Robert. Sing Key, appreciate the fact that you're on during your spring break from the Ohio State University, being on spring break. I think Barry's on vacation today, still jumped on here. So appreciate the work that everybody has. So any closing comments from our team?
Have a good week.
Yeah, and the only thing we can say is have a great weekend. Go Bucks, because at 12:45 we tip off, and my Boilermakers tip off this afternoon. So it's going to be a good afternoon for March Madness here. So with that, as always, we hope to see you in April for the Farm Office Live, and we'll click out here with some party music. But thanks for everyone joining us today.